I watch some movies, specifically some films that film nerds absolutely cream their pants over, and as someone with 100% correct opinions on everything that there is to have opinions of, I thought I'd make a video letting you know which ones are worth watching, because it always goes over really well and doesn't end in a bunch of crybabies wrongly accusing me of being wrong on a semi-weekly basis forever. I don't technically have a license to have opinions on film, so please, if we could just keep this between us, so I don't get hounded by the licensed opinion havers with Letterboxd accounts and media literacy, that would be great. So without further ado, here are my initial impressions on some movies and TV shows, and whether or not they're worth your time as a normal, functioning, sane person. Oh, and before you comment, how is this your first time watching this, or how have you not seen this before? Instead of doing that, I want you to go out to your car, unlock it, open one of the doors, and slam your dick in it. Starting in chronological order, I saw The Cabinet of Dr. Calamari, which didn't have any fried squid or marinara dipping sauce, so that was disappointing. It's a silent film that was made more than 100 years ago, which is neat, which is cool, but I'm only interested in my viewing experience, and I nearly fell asleep halfway through. Fortunately, I was able to stay awake and experience it in its entirety because I am that much of a hero. And here were my impressions. From the very first scene of the movie, I immediately lost all respect for Tim Burton because everything that made the aesthetic of his movies look interesting and unique was ripped straight from this. There's probably a more sophisticated way of saying that, like he was inspired by German Expressionism or some bullshit, but to me it's like, oh look, nothing is symmetrical and everything is oddly shaped or greatly exaggerated. These guys are sitting on really high chairs, isn't that funny? That made me think of Pee-wee's Playhouse, and I thought, oh yeah, Tim Burton directed Pee-wee's Big Adventure, that makes a lot of sense. Anyway, spoilers for a movie that your great-grandparents may have been alive to see, but it's about a hypnotist at a carnival who uses a somnambulist to commit murders. A somnambulist is a sleepwalking person, but in the movie, people use this word like it's really common and everybody knows what that is. Which, holy shit, people 100 years ago must have spoken way differently than we do. Like, yeah, I went and saw a somnambulist, Jim, you dick. Why, I bet they didn't even say Riz or bussin', and that's most certainly not bussin', fam, on God, for real, for real. So after this guy's friend was killed and his girl was kidnapped, he investigates the murders and tracks down a hypnotist to an insane asylum where he's a doctor who studies sleepwalking. But the movie ends with the twist that the guy hunting the doctor is actually a patient at the insane asylum, and this was all just a delusion he was having. So not only did Tim Burton rip off this movie for his entire career, the story is basically Shutter Island, Martin Scorsese, you fucking hack. Anyway, I would not recommend The Cabaret of Mr. Caligula unless you are really interested in film history, because that's the only way it becomes enjoyable to sit down and watch. I think that over time people develop different viewing habits, similar to how TV shows in the 60s were these 10-part snooze fests where nothing really happened for half the episodes. I think anyone who says they'd like to throw this on and enjoy it for the story is fucking lying or trying to impress you, which I'm not. Fuck you.
Ciao Bru, se vediamo stasera alle 7, aspettami qua, Ciao.
Another movie I saw for the first time was Bicycle Thieves, an Italian film about a man struggling in post-World War II Rome. The movie opens with him finally getting a decent job hanging posters around the city, but it's a job which will require a bicycle to get around town, because, you know, it's Europe, so they aren't allowed to use their Ford F-150s. The problem is that he had already pawned his bicycle, but he is able to get it back quickly once his wife pawns their sheets. Then, on his first day on the job, his bicycle gets stolen, and the rest of the movie is about him and his son trying to track it down and get it back. They are ultimately unsuccessful, and the film ends with him trying to steal another person's bicycle, only to be immediately caught by a mob of people and shamed right in front of his son. So basically it's like a much, much less violent version of Falling Down, Michael Douglas, you fucking hack. Now the thing about this movie is that if you talk to film nerds, they will agree that this is one of the greatest, saddest, and most important films ever made. And I flat out do not understand any of that. I think the reason this movie gets so much praise is because this movie speaks to the sort of person who studies film or becomes a film nerd, because they're all fucking communists. Okay, hear me out. So this movie is really sad because of how shit the world had become after the war, and it seems like the deck is stacked against this man who's just trying to work and raise his family. But when I watch the movie, as a rugged individualist, all I see is a complete and total fuck-up. And what's weirder is that I think the movie is trying pretty damn hard to express this as well, despite what a bunch of commie film buffs say about it. The movie opens with a crowd of men all desperately waiting to be assigned work, and his name is called. And where is he? He fell asleep nearby and almost lost the job. They show him hanging exactly one movie poster before his bicycle was stolen, and he did a shitty job of it. He did exactly what the guy told him not to do, which is to have a bunch of wrinkles in it. When he and his son are out looking for the bicycle, every decision he makes is wrong, and also his kid keeps falling down, hurting, or almost seriously injuring himself, and nearly getting kidnapped by a pervert. Oh, and did I mention the kid has a fucking job? If I didn't know any film nerds and watched this movie, my main takeaway from it would be that it was about a total loser who was incapable of doing anything without assistance from those around him. Someone who only thinks of others in relation to himself. The one thing he does independently of others is steal, and he immediately fails at that too. Now, the reason I say this movie is beloved by commies is because that is a very communist outlook on the world. The collectivist is someone who believes that the failure of one is a failure of all. That this man was let down by a community that should have cared for him, while an individualist, such as myself, believes that his failures are just that, his failures. That he couldn't succeed despite receiving assistance from his wife, his son, his friends, people at the local community center, because the problem wasn't with the failures of the community, but with him. It reminded me of 2019's Parasite, and more specifically, a review written in a Korean newspaper that talked about how differently the film was received there than in the West. To many Koreans, the film is clearly about a family of lower-class people who were brought down by the many obvious failures of the father, coupled with a patriarchal society that expects wives and children to honor and respect husbands and fathers, even if that means following them to their own ruin. The review argued that the father in the film is quite clearly the titular parasite. But to Western film scholars and Hollywood at large, the film is actually a critique of class, i.e. it's a critique of capitalism, i.e. commie shit. To them, the titular parasites are the people who have money and are successful. Yes, the villains of the movie aren't the family who lie, steal, and ultimately murder. It's the people who hire them and tell one of them that they smell bad. Now, at this point, the media literate person will say, this movie means what I say, and the director himself supports me. As if there is no reason why a director from South Korea would play along with what the most powerful and influential institution in film wants his work to be. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. Bicycle Thieves is a gorgeously shot window into post-World War II Europe, with a vibrant setting and cast despite the use of untrained actors. So I guess it's a recommend, I just don't see it for the class critique that many do. Rashomon is the first of 2 Kurosawa films I watched. It's about a priest and some other dude taking shelter from a rainstorm at a temple, and they're joined by some other dude, and the first 2 dudes tell the other dude different versions of a murder in the area that one of them witnessed, along with versions of events as told by others in court. It's one of those films that tells a story where the story of the story is more important than the story, if you know what I mean. It's a pretty ingenious way to craft a narrative, but it's not without its flaws, in that it doesn't seem like the movie has enough to say to fill its own runtime. Some versions of the accounts feel like they drag on a bit, to the point that I found myself wanting to return to the men just chilling and waiting out the rain. Also, I don't know shit about film production, but this has some of the most impressive rain you will ever see in a film. But that sounds like some real film nerd shit, so I'm sorry. Also, this guy's laugh cracks me up. That dude is awesome. I'd give this a recommend if you're interested in the mechanics of storytelling and film production, but it might not be for you if you just want to be entertained.
Okay.
Sticking with the exact same director, we have Yojimbo. If you're a fan of westerns like the Sergio Leone trilogy, then this may be for you, since it's basically just a huge ripoff of Fistful of Dollars, with samurai standing in for gunslingers. That sound you just heard was every film scholar in the world having a simultaneous aneurysm, since A Fistful of Dollars was actually one of the most shameless copy-pasting of another movie in cinematic history when it ripped off Yojimbo. But there's this weird incestuous circle of inspiration, where many westerns were inspired by samurai films, which were inspired by film noir, which were inspired by westerns. But I guess we can trace all stories back to either Beowulf, The Tale of Genji, or 1001 Nights, so who gives a shit? Anyway, I think as a sit-down, watch and be entertained movie, I prefer Yojimbo to Rashomon. It's about a samurai who comes to a town and fucks shit up for money, but then discovers a more noble purpose in helping the citizens there. Some notable things this movie has in common with Rashomon are how the setting and even the weather feel like characters. They also share a comical, almost satirical view of masculine bravado and violence, as you see men act boastful and over the top about how tough they are, only to become timid, scared, and shaking like reeds in a storm once somebody actually stands opposite them with a sword. If you're already a fan of Fistful of Dollars, Yojimbo is essentially a funnier version of that movie, coupled with a bit more optimism about the world it portrays. Definitely a recommend.
I spent on the people who did this. And I caused the price I have to pay. I'm making my peace with it. Now you make yours. Go into that water. As it must be done.
And finally, a random dip into something contemporary with Chernobyl, the 5-part HBO miniseries about the famed Chernobyl nuclear plant disaster of 1986. The show stars the guy who hung himself in Mad Men and opens with him hanging himself again. Damn, dude, do you need somebody to talk to? We then jump back to moments before the Chernobyl disaster and proceed throughout the brutal and oftentimes absurd efforts to clean up the fallout and prevent a further cataclysmic environmental disaster. We see how the shadowy machinations of Soviet bureaucracy led to and frequently made a horrific situation considerably worse. Now, this may sound strange, but this series was extremely cathartic for me. For the past, 75 years? There has been a constant, unending stream of films and TV shows depicting the horrific, inhuman, monstrous actions of a certain German regime in the 1940s. And yet, while that was happening, their neighbors to the east were doing similarly horrific things to many, many more people for close to 70 years, and it is almost never shown in any major films or TV shows. For some strange reason, there are almost never any representations of the atrocities perpetrated by the communists. I wonder why that is. So for someone who has studied both the history of economics and the history of the Soviet Union, Chernobyl is like a breath of ironically fresh air. It does a remarkable job not just in showing the grisly, heinous effects of the Chernobyl disaster, but precisely how it was caused and mismanaged by the structures of authoritarian Soviet bureaucracy. There's a scene in the first episode shortly after the explosion, in which various party leaders meet in a basement to discuss what the next course of action should be, and any sense of urgency is swiftly put to rest by the eldest member of the party, who proceeds to give a short speech about the greatness of Lenin, and how disaster isn't possible in the great Soviet Union, nor is its mismanagement because of the inherent greatness of the state, at which point everyone stands and applauds in agreement, with an almost spiritual assuredness that they will be rewarded for their faith and justness. It perfectly captures the flaws of the Soviet Union and communism in general, that because your goal is to build a perfect utopia, and you are incapable of failure, any imperfections must inherently be the result of those undermining your perfect system, since the system itself must be without flaw. You see this time and time again throughout the series, as people who attempt to remedy the situation by questioning what is being done are told that they are demonstrating a lack of faith in the party, resulting in officials who are more interested in maintaining the appearances of success than actually succeeding. The engineers on duty mutter to themselves that they did everything correctly, even though they know they didn't, but they were following orders, which are always correct, regardless of outcome. In the final episode, we learn that the cause of the disaster was a safety test that the 3 men in charge of the plant wanted done so they could attain promotions. The test required them to lower the plant's power output, but was initially delayed due to it being the last day of the month, a day in which a nearby state-run factory has quotas to meet. It's another, albeit more subtle layer, wherein every institution acts at the behest of a bureaucracy in filling arbitrary goals. Bureaucracy layered over bureaucracy, staffed by party officials whose interest in performing their duties to the public lag far behind their duties to follow seemingly arbitrary orders from the system. The show portrays this to such a stunningly accurate degree that the viewer often needs to seek out all the examples in order to uncover them all. But the show isn't perfect, obviously. It jumps from character perspective to character perspective, a la every HBO series. The problem is that it's not a one-size-fits-all form of storytelling. Just because it works so well on The Wire or The Sopranos doesn't mean it belongs everywhere. In most of these dramas, the viewer is enticed by different characters and plot lines because of how they will ultimately tie together. This isn't so much the case when we already know that the thread connecting them all is the gigantic fucking nuclear explosion at the beginning. So this creates what I'm calling a character sink, where the show cuts to another character and the feeling in the viewer is immediately, oh, I don't care about this nearly as much. Can we go back to the more interesting situation? Another issue I took with the show was how it leaned into, let's call it the human element. This is a tragedy, and it's important for the audience to experience the very real, very costly, heartbreaking toll incurred by the citizens in and around Chernobyl. One of the very first scenes in the show was of the wife of a firefighter throwing up, signifying that she was in the early stages of pregnancy. We then followed her story throughout as her husband fought the fires raging at the power plant, was hospitalized before being transferred to a hospital in Moscow, and her journey to stay by his side, despite repeated warnings of the danger. He ultimately perishes in agony from the radiation poisoning, but the human element is that of a wife who refuses to let her husband die alone, even at the cost of both herself and her unborn child. We then see her months later sitting on a park bench, clutching her very pregnant stomach. In the series finale, we learn that her baby had absorbed most of the radiation and died within hours of being born. But we learn this not by experiencing it as we have all series, but by being told about it by other characters. In episode 4, the episode before the finale, we are introduced to a soldier as he arrives near Chernobyl and follow him as he hunts local abandoned pets. Yeah, just prolonged scenes of him and a couple other soldiers shooting dogs and cats. Brutal stuff for sure, but after this the character we followed never shows up again. So instead of continuing our journey with the woman as we have been from the beginning, we abandon the conclusion of her story arc to spend half an episode having our heartstrings pulled on. What a misstep. But as far as stories go, this is a must-watch, if only to be reminded what horrid pieces of shit communists were and are. Later.